The evening air was heavy with tension as Officer Karen approached the crime scene. Her boots crunched over the gravel driveway as she passed under the yellow tape flapping in the wind. The suburban house in front of her looked almost peaceful, but the flashing lights of the patrol cars and the small cluster of officers broke the illusion. The presence of death lingered in the air like a thick fog. As Karen walked toward the scene, she noticed Officer Peter standing near the body of a man lying on the lawn. The man, dressed in a blood-soaked shirt and jeans, was black, mid-30s, and unmoving. Peter's expression was grave as he surveyed the scene, his hands resting lightly on his belt. Karen, however, was already jumping to conclusions. "Peter," she called out, her voice sharp and matter-of-fact, "what's going on here? What's with all the commotion?" Peter turned his head to face her, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the storm brewing in Karen's eyes. "Karen, we've got a homicide. The homeowner was stabbed to death. We're still gathering evidence, but it looks like a single suspect fled the scene not long ago." Karen's gaze locked onto the body, her lips curling slightly as if she had already solved the case. "Stabbed to death, huh? And I bet this one," she gestured dismissively toward the victim, "isn't so innocent either. Probably involved in some gang fight that went wrong." Peter felt his stomach tighten. He'd worked with Karen for long enough to know where this was headed. But tonight, something in her voice was different, more cutting, more insistent. He stepped closer, lowering his voice in an attempt to keep the situation calm. "Karen, this is the victim. He was the homeowner, and he's been murdered. We're here to investigate who killed him, not to assume anything." Karen crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing as she stared at the body with disdain. "A black guy in this neighborhood? Come on, Peter, let's not kid ourselves. This has got gang-related written all over it. We don't need to waste resources digging too deep here. I say we round up his buddies and get some confessions." Peter's frustration was beginning to bubble to the surface, but he held it in check. He had to stay professional. "Karen, there's no evidence to suggest that. We're still investigating, and we've got witness reports saying they saw someone fleeing the scene, someone who doesn't match the profile you're assuming." She raised an eyebrow, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Let me guess, another black guy. Peter, they're all the same in these kinds of cases. You know how it is. One thug goes down and another one takes his place. Let's wrap this up before it turns into a circus." Peter's hands balled into fists, though he kept them by his side. He was losing patience. "Karen, you're jumping to conclusions. We're not here to decide guilt based on skin color. This man is dead. He's the victim, not the suspect. We owe it to him and his family to find out the truth." But Karen wasn't listening. Her mind had already made up a version of events that fit her prejudices. She glanced at the other officers standing by, and the smallest smirk played at the corners of her mouth, as if she expected them to agree with her. She stepped closer to the body, her eyes flickering with something dangerous, a mix of arrogance and apathy. "Peter, be real. This man's probably just another criminal who got what was coming to him. Black on black crime, just like always. So what if he's dead? What's the big deal?" Her voice grew colder with each word. "Should I put another couple of bullets in him to make sure he stays down?" That was it. Peter had heard enough. His voice, usually steady and composed, now carried a hard edge. "Karen, what the hell is wrong with you? That's the victim lying there. A human being who was murdered, and you're treating this like it's just another statistic." Karen rolled her eyes, her disdain evident in every movement. "Peter, save the lecture. You're wasting your time and mine. I've seen enough of these cases to know how it ends. This isn't about justice, it's about getting this neighborhood back to normal. His wife or baby mama can mourn for him later, but right now we need to move on." Peter clenched his jaw, desperately trying to maintain his professionalism. He could feel his control slipping, but before he could respond, a commanding voice cut through the tension. "That's enough, Officer Karen." Both Peter and Karen turned to see Captain Leo approaching the scene. His presence was immediate, his expression unreadable yet authoritative. Karen visibly stiffened at the sight of him, her usual bravado faltering for a split second, before she quickly masked it with a fake smile. "Captain," Karen greeted him, trying to sound nonchalant. "Just trying to solve this case like always." Leo's eyes were cold as he studied her. "Is that what you call it? Solving cases by assuming guilt based on race?" Karen's smile wavered, but she held her ground. "I'm just saying, Captain, that we've seen this before. These kinds of neighborhoods, these kinds of crimes, it's usually the same story. We know how it ends." Leo stepped closer, his voice steady but firm. "No, Karen, we don't know how it ends. And that's why we investigate. We don't assume. We don't let our prejudices dictate our actions. This man," he pointed to the body, "is the homeowner. He lived here, and he was murdered. You've been letting your bias control you from the moment you stepped onto this scene. Karen opened her mouth to protest, but Leo wasn't finished. And it's not just today. I've been receiving complaints about your behavior for months now from your colleagues, from the people you're supposed to protect. You've crossed a line, Karen. Her confidence was visibly cracking, her voice smaller now. Captain, I was just trying to. Enough, Leo interrupted, his tone hardening. I've had enough of your excuses. We set up this sting operation to expose officers like you officers who let their prejudices get in the way of doing their job. And today you proved exactly what I've been hearing. You're done, Karen. Color drained from Karen's face as the full weight of Leo's words hit her. Her eyes darted between Peter and Leo, searching for any sign of support. But there was none. The smug arrogance she carried evaporated, replaced by panic. Wait, you can't be serious, she stammered, her voice shaking. I'm not a racist. I'm just doing my job. Your job, Leo said coldly, is to serve and protect everyone, not just the ones you think are worth it. He turned to Peter. Officer Peter, arrest Officer Karen for obstruction of justice and discriminatory conduct. We're taking her in. Peter, though conflicted, nodded, knowing what had to be done. He stepped forward, handcuffs ready. Karen, you know the drill.
Karen stepped back, shaking her head in disbelief. No, you can't do this. I didn't do anything wrong. This isn't fair.
Leo's expression didn't change. Fair. Karen, this is about justice. You've let your bias control you for too long. Now it's time to face the consequences. As Peter placed the cuffs on her wrists, Karen's bravado finally shattered. Her eyes filled with panic, her voice trembling. Please, I didn't mean it. I can explain. I'm not a racist. This isn't happening.
But it was. And there was no turning back now.
The air was thick with tension as Captain Leo stepped out of his patrol car and approached the scene. His tall, imposing figure cast a long shadow over the crime scene, where the body of a black man lay still on the blood-stained lawn. Officers stood scattered, some whispering in hushed tones, others silently collecting evidence. But all eyes, whether furtive or focused, seemed to drift toward Officer Karen, who stood too close to the body, her posture defensive, her expression hardened with defiance. Leo's sharp gaze landed on Karen. Even from a distance, he could tell something was wrong. He had seen this look on Karen before, the way she stiffened at the sight of a black victim, how her mind seemed to make conclusions before any evidence had been fully examined. And tonight, it seemed worse than ever. He strode forward, his voice carrying authority as he called out, Karen, step away from the body. Karen flinched slightly at the command, but she didn't move. Her back remained turned, her hand resting on her gun holster, as if she were still considering some imaginary threat. Behind her, Officer Peter shifted uncomfortably, sensing the growing tension between his fellow officer and the captain. Peter had tried to keep Karen in check throughout the investigation, but it was clear her biases were taking control. Captain, Karen finally muttered, her voice thin with impatience. I've got this handled. Handled? Leo's brow furrowed, his steps deliberate as he moved closer. He glanced down at the dead man, his body sprawled unnaturally on the ground, his blood pooling into the grass beneath him. Leo had seen enough homicides in his career to know that something terrible had unfolded here, but what caught his attention even more was the way Karen was behaving. This is clearly a gang hit, Karen continued, ignoring the growing displeasure in Leo's gaze. I've seen it 100 times before. We can wrap this up quickly, no need to make it complicated. A thug got what was coming to him. Peter's heart raced as he stood nearby, his eyes darting from Leo to Karen, hoping for a way to intervene before things spiraled further. But Karen's words were like gasoline to the fire. Leo's face hardened, and the silence around them seemed to intensify as he took another step forward, his voice deep with controlled anger. A thug, Karen. Is that what you see? Karen glanced back at Leo, her expression defiant. Yes, Captain. We both know how this goes. A gangbanger gets taken out in a high-crime neighborhood, and we spend hours investigating a crime we already know the answer to. It's black-on-black violence, plain and simple. Leo's eyes darkened. His tone became colder, more deliberate. So, because he's black, because this neighborhood doesn't match your ideal, you think you already know everything about him?
Karen scoffed, waving a hand dismissively. Look, I'm just being practical. We've got enough on our plates without wasting time on.
Leo cut her off sharply. Wasting time? Is that what you think this is? His voice echoed with a restrained fury, every word carefully measured. This man had a family, He had a life. He's the victim here, Karen. And you're treating him like he's nothing more than a statistic. The air seemed to grow heavier as the other officers began to take notice of the escalating argument. Some stepped back, not wanting to be caught in the crossfire, while others watched with morbid curiosity. Leo's reputation was well known. He was a man of integrity, a captain who had built his career on justice and fairness, but even he was rarely seen this angry. Karen turned to fully face Leo now, her jaw clenched. "Captain, I'm just trying to keep things real. I've been on the force long enough to know how these things go. We see the same stuff over and over. A dead black guy in a bad part of town, it's not rocket science." Peter watched the exchange, his chest tightening with the weight of Karen's words. He could see it, the growing divide between her perception and reality, the cracks in her professionalism widening by the second. Peter had always suspected Karen harbored deep biases, but now it was all laid bare for everyone to see. She wasn't just making bad calls, she was actively sabotaging justice with her prejudice. Leo took another step forward, his voice lowering to a dangerous growl. "You think you know how things go because you stopped doing your job, Karen. You've stopped seeing the people in front of you and started assuming things based on the color of their skin." Karen's eyes flashed with frustration. "Captain, I'm just following my instincts. I know how to read a scene. And this." Leo's voice snapped through the night like a whip. This is you letting your biases control you. And you know what? I've been hearing about it for a long time. Complaints from your fellow officers, from the people in this community. And tonight you've gone too far." Karen's mouth fell open, her defiance faltering. "Complaints? About me?" Leo stepped even closer, his eyes locking to hers with a cold intensity that made the hairs on the back of Karen's neck stand on end. "You think I haven't noticed? I've watched you, Karen. You've been letting your prejudices get in the way of your duty for too long, and tonight it ends." Karen stammered, her earlier bravado slipping away as reality started to close in around her. I didn't mean anything by it, Captain. I'm just..." "You didn't mean it," Leo interrupted, his voice laced with sarcasm. "You didn't mean to disrespect a dead man, assume his guilt just because of his skin color, and dismiss an entire investigation based on your racism? That's what you didn't mean." Karen's hands trembled, though she clenched them into fists at her sides to hide her growing fear. Her mind raced, searching for some way to salvage the situation. But Leo wasn't giving her any ground to stand on.
Leo turned to the other officers, his voice rising above the stillness. "Listen up, everyone. This is what happens when we let prejudice guide us instead of justice. This is why we have rules, why we investigate, why we don't let our personal biases get in the way of our duty."
Karen stepped forward, her voice desperate now. "Captain, please, you can't arrest me for this. I was just doing my job." Leo's voice was ice. "Your job is to serve and protect everyone in this community, not just the ones who fit into your narrow worldview. And tonight you failed." The silence that followed was suffocating. Every officer present understood the gravity of what was happening. Karen, who had once walked with confidence, now stood before her captain with no defense left, her earlier arrogance stripped away, leaving nothing but fear and regret. Leo looked to Peter, his expression softening for just a moment. "Officer Peter, arrest Officer Karen for obstruction of justice and conduct unbecoming of a police officer." Peter, though shaken, nodded and stepped forward, the weight of what he had to do heavy in his chest. He pulled out his handcuffs, his movements deliberate, careful. "Karen," he said quietly, "please turn around." Karen's eyes filled with tears she fought hard to suppress. She took a shaky breath, her voice barely above a whisper. "Peter, please, don't do this." But Peter's resolve was firm. "Karen, you know I have to." She turned, her shoulders slumped, and Peter gently cuffed her wrists. As he did, Leo's voice rang out once more, this time softer but still firm. "Karen, no one is above the law, not even us." The officers around them stood in stunned silence, some averting their eyes, others watching with grim understanding. As Peter led Karen away, her head hung low, the weight of her actions finally catching up to her. Leo stood still for a long moment, watching as Karen was taken to the patrol car, his heart heavy. This was the part of the job he never got used to, holding his own officers accountable. But it was necessary. Justice wasn't just for the citizens they served, it was for everyone, even those in uniform. Tonight, justice had been done, and it was a stark reminder to everyone that the law didn't discriminate. But Karen's fall from grace was also a lesson in the dangers of unchecked prejudice, how it could destroy careers, lives, and communities. And as the patrol cars pulled away, the truth settled over the scene like a heavy fog. Racism had no place in the pursuit of juice, and those who carried it with them would inevitably fall. The tension in the room was palpable. Officer Karen, now handcuffed, her wrists cold against the metal, stood frozen in disbelief. Her mind raced, replaying the last few minutes as if they were fragments of a bad dream. How had it come to this? She was supposed to be in control. She was supposed to be the one upholding the law, not becoming its prisoner. Officer Peter led Karen toward the squad car. His movements were slow, methodical, but there was a heaviness in the air that neither of them could ignore. Peter's heart pounded in his chest, each step feeling like it weighed more than the last. He didn't want to be here. He didn't want to be the one escorting Karen to her downfall, but there was no denying what she had done. There was no turning back. Karen's mind flickered with flashes of fear and anger. It wasn't supposed to end like this. She had always been the one calling the shots, the one making decisions. She couldn't believe that Peter, of all people, was the one to turn on her. She tried to swallow her fear, but it burned in her throat. She could feel the eyes of her colleagues on her, some filled with quiet pity, others with thinly veiled contempt. As they reached the door of the squad car, Karen made her move. Without warning, she spun around, catching Peter off guard. In one fluid motion, she drove her shoulder into his chest, knocking him off balance. Peter stumbled backward, and before anyone could react, Karen was running. The adrenaline surged through her veins, drowning out any rational thoughts. Her handcuffs clinked together as she sprinted down the street, her heart hammering in her ears. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew she had to get away. The night air was cool, but her skin burned with panic. Behind her, chaos erupted. Peter scrambled to his feet, shouting into his radio, "We have an officer fleeing. Karen's on the run. I need backup now." The radio crackled in response, and within moments, sirens pierced the quiet suburban night. Red and blue lights flashed, illuminating the street like a chaotic strobe, casting long shadows against the buildings. Karen ran faster, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. She could feel the weight of everything pressing down on her, the accusations, the truth, the reality of what she had done. She had let her prejudice take control, had ignored the very oath she swore to uphold. And now, as the weight of her decisions came crashing down, she was running from the consequences, running from herself. But no matter how fast she ran, the truth was catching up. As Karen rounded a corner, her body collided with something solid. She stumbled backward, disoriented, and looked up to see a figure standing before her, a passerby. A middle-aged man with kind eyes, his expression unreadable in the dim light. He didn't look surprised, as though he had been expecting her. "You look like you're in trouble, officer," the man said, his voice calm, almost gentle. Karen's chest heaved as she struggled to catch her breath. Her mind whirled with excuses, justifications, anything to explain her situation. "I know you don't understand. They're trying to frame me. I didn't do anything wrong." The man's eyes softened with something like pity. "Maybe, but running isn't going to solve it, is it?" Karen blinked, taken aback by the simplicity of his words. She felt the weight of them sink into her chest, heavier than the handcuffs that bound her. She wanted to argue, to defend herself, but the words died in her throat. "What do you know about it?" she shot back, though her voice lacked the fire it once held. There was desperation there now, raw and exposed. The man sighed softly, as if he had seen this all before. "I've seen people like you," he said, his voice low and steady. "People who made mistakes and couldn't face them. Running away from your problems only makes them bigger. It's never too late to face the truth and make it right." Karen's eyes flickered with confusion. For a moment she thought about turning around, about trying to escape again, but the man's words held her in place. It was as if she were rooted to the ground, the weight of her guilt pressing down on her. "What should I do?" she asked, her voice breaking for the first time. The man took a step closer, but not in a threatening way. His gaze was filled with understanding, but also with an unspoken demand for honesty. "Turn yourself in. Admit what you've done. It's the only way to find peace." Karen swallowed hard, the reality of her situation finally sinking in. She was trapped. There was nowhere left to run, nowhere left to hide from the truth she had tried so desperately to avoid. Her shoulders sagged, and for the first time in a long while she felt small, fragile even. Her arrogance, her certainty, all of it had crumbled away, leaving her with nothing but the cold, hard truth. Behind her, the sound of approaching sirens grew louder, and the flashing lights became more pronounced. The police cars were closing in. Peter and the others wouldn't be far behind. Karen nodded slowly, her decision made. Back at the crime scene, Captain Leo was barking orders into his radio, organizing a perimeter. She couldn't have gotten far. Set up a 2-mile perimeter around 54th Street. I want every available unit on this. We need to bring her in before she causes more harm. Peter, nursing a bruise from his fall, stood by Leo, his expression tight with frustration. Do you think she'll come to her senses, Captain? Turn herself in. Leo, still focused on the operation at hand, glanced at Peter. I hope so, Peter. But we can't take that chance. We need to bring her in before she makes things worse for herself. Just then, the radio crackled to life. Captain, this is Unit 14. We've got eyes on Karen. She's on 54th and Broadway. Looks like she stopped. We're moving in now. Leo exchanged a glance with Peter. Let's move. Karen's lungs burned as she ran through the dimly lit streets, her footsteps echoing against the silent night. The handcuffs clinked with every desperate stride, her wrists bound but her mind unshackled by fear. The chaos of what she had just done, assaulting Peter, running from her duty, from the truth, was suffocating, pressing in on her from all sides. The sound of sirens in the distance was growing louder. They were closing in. She had no plan, no destination. Just the primal instinct to flee, to escape the consequences that loomed ever closer. Career, her reputation. Everything she had built was crumbling around her, but she wasn't ready to face it. Not yet. Yet. As she sprinted down a narrow alleyway, her feet skidded to a halt when she saw someone blocking her path. A man middle-aged, with a calm and steady presence, stood there, as if he had been waiting for her. He didn't move, didn't speak right away, just watched her with an expression of understanding that unnerved her more than the chase. Karen breathed heavily, her chest heaving, hands trembling. For a moment they stood in silence, the distant wail of police sirens the only sound breaking the night. The man tilted his head slightly, his voice quiet but firm. You're running from something, aren't you? Karen's instinct screamed at her to push past him, to keep running, but something in his voice stopped her. It wasn't accusatory. It wasn't filled with judgment. It was almost compassionate. I don't have time for this, Karen muttered, her voice hoarse. I need to go. You can't outrun it, the man said, taking a slow step forward, his eyes never leaving hers. You know that, don't you? Karen's heart pounded in her chest, not just from the exertion of running but from the weight of his words. He wasn't talking about the police. He was talking about something deeper, something she had been trying to bury for a long time, her guilt, her mistakes, the choices she had made that had led her to this moment. I didn't do anything wrong, Karen stammered, though even she didn't believe her own words anymore. They're blowing it out of proportion. I'm not the bad guy here. The man's eyes softened, and for a moment, Karen hated how understanding he seemed. She didn't want understanding. She wanted to keep running, to keep justifying her actions, but the truth was already gnawing at her insides. We all make mistakes, the man said, his voice steady and calm, but running from them only makes them worse. Karen swallowed hard, her throat tight. You don't understand. They're coming after me for doing my job. I was trying to protect people. I'm not a bad cop. I'm not a... Her voice trailed off as the words felt hollow in her mouth. The memory of the dead man's face flashed in her mind, the face of the victim she had so easily dismissed as a criminal. The reality of her prejudice, of the assumptions she had made, struck her with a force she couldn't ignore. The man stepped closer but still kept his distance, giving her space to confront the truth herself. You're not a bad person, he said quietly, but you made choices that hurt people. And now it's time to face what those choices have done. Karen's shoulders sagged, the weight of everything crashing down on her all at once. The sirens were getting louder, the red and blue lights reflecting off the walls of the alley as the police cars closed in. She was trapped, but not just by the physical presence of the law. She was trapped by her own actions, her own decisions. There was nowhere left to run, not from the truth. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she blinked them away, her pride fighting against the flood of guilt threatening to overwhelm her. What am I supposed to do? She whispered, her voice breaking. The man took a deep breath, his gaze unwavering. Turn yourself in. Admit what you've done. That's the only way forward. Karen closed her eyes, the sting of tears burning behind her eyelids. She knew he was right. She had known it from the moment she put those handcuffs on the corpse, from the moment she let her prejudice cloud her judgment, from the moment she had crossed that line. The wail of the sirens was deafening now, the alleyway bathed in the flashing lights of approaching police cars. Karen opened her eyes and saw the officers stepping out of their vehicles, guns drawn, their voices echoing through the alley as they shouted orders. Karen, Stop where you are. Put your hands up. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Karen didn't run. She didn't fight. She didn't make excuses. She turned slowly, raising her hands above her head, her heart pounding in her chest as the officers approached. The officers moved cautiously toward Karen, their weapons trained on her, unsure of what she might do next. Officer Peter, his face still bruised from the earlier altercation, was the first to reach her. His expression was a mixture of relief, frustration, and something softer pity, perhaps. He had worked alongside Karen for years, had seen her at her best and her worst, but this was something different. Karen, Peter said quietly as he reached for his cuffs. You made the right choice. Karen's throat was tight, her eyes avoiding Peter's as he recuffed her wrists. I didn't have a choice, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Peter tightened the handcuffs, not out of malice, but because protocol demanded it. He glanced at the other officers, signaling that the situation was under control, and they slowly lowered their weapons. The alley was quiet again, the only sound the distant hum of the city, and the soft click of Karen's handcuffs. As Peter began to lead her back toward the patrol car, Captain Leo appeared at the edge of the scene, his face unreadable. He watched as Karen was escorted toward him, his arms crossed over his chest. The weight of what had transpired hung heavily in the air between them. Karen met his gaze for the briefest moment, expecting to see anger or disgust, but instead there was something else: disappointment, perhaps, but also a quiet understanding. You did the right thing, Karen, Leo said, his voice low but firm. Facing this, owning up to it. Karen swallowed, her throat dry, her mind still reeling. She nodded, unable to speak. As she was placed into the back of the squad car, Peter and Leo exchanged a glance. There was nothing more to say. The wheels of justice had been set in motion, and now it was up to the system to hold her accountable. As the car door closed, Karen leaned her head back against the seat, staring up at the ceiling of the vehicle. The weight of her actions pressed down on her, heavier than the cuffs around her wrists. She had spent years hiding behind her badge, behind her assumptions, thinking she was protecting the world from danger. But now she realized that the danger she had been trying to protect others from was inside her all along. The ride back to the precinct was silent. Karen's mind was a storm of regret, guilt, and shame. But beneath it all, there was a small flicker of something else: acceptance. She had made her choices, and now she would face the consequences. In the rearview mirror, Karen saw Peter's eyes meet hers briefly, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't look away. The fluorescent lights in the police precinct buzzed faintly as Karen sat at the interrogation table, her hands shackled together, her gaze fixed on the dull surface in front of her. The hum of the building was a stark contrast to the chaos that had unfolded in the last few hours. Everything had moved so quickly, from her impulsive attempt to escape to the quiet, somber surrender in the alley. Now there was nothing but silence, punctuated by the distant chatter of officers and the occasional ring of a phone. Across from her sat Captain Leo, his usual authoritative presence now weighed down by the gravity of the situation. He studied her quietly, his expression unreadable, though Karen could feel the disappointment emanating from him. There was no anger, just the steady weight of consequences that had finally caught up with her. Peter stood beside Leo, his face a mixture of sadness and professionalism. This wasn't the outcome anyone had wanted, but it was necessary. They had to follow the same rules they were sworn to uphold, and Karen's actions had crossed a line from which there was no return. For a long moment, no one spoke. The tension in the room was palpable, thick with the weight of what had happened. Karen's once defiant posture had deflated, her eyes downcast, her earlier bravado now nothing more than a hollow shell. The silence was heavy, pressing in on her from all sides. Finally, Leo broke the stillness, his voice steady but firm. Karen, the investigation into your conduct has been concluded. Karen didn't look up, but her jaw tightened, the words hitting her like stones. She knew what was coming. She had known the moment she was led into the precinct in handcuffs, but hearing it aloud made it all too real. Leo continued, his gaze unwavering. We've reviewed the body cam footage, the reports, and the statements from your colleagues. There's no denying what happened. You acted on prejudice, you obstructed justice, and you assaulted a fellow officer. These are serious charges, Karen. She swallowed hard, the lump in her throat making it difficult to breathe. She wanted to defend herself, to explain that she hadn't meant for it to go this far. But the truth was undeniable now. She had let her biases guide her actions, had let her fear and assumptions dictate her decisions. And now, there was no escaping the consequences. Leo leaned forward slightly, his voice softer now but no less resolute. "You'll be formally charged with obstruction of justice, misconduct, and assault. Given the gravity of your actions, you'll be dismissed from the force, effective immediately." The finality of those words settled heavily over the room. Karen closed her eyes, a wave of shame washing over her. She had spent years wearing the badge, believing she was upholding the law, protecting her community. But somewhere along the way, she had lost sight of what that truly meant. She had allowed her prejudices to cloud her judgment, to poison her actions, and now she had lost everything. Peter, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke, his voice thick with emotion. "Karen, I tried to help you. I wanted to believe you were better than this." His words stung, not because they were meant to hurt, but because they were true. Karen had been blind to the warnings, to the subtle nudges from her colleagues, and the overt complaints from the community. She had brushed them off, convinced that she knew better, that her instincts were infallible. But in the end, it was those very instincts warped by years of unchecked bias that had led to her downfall. Karen finally looked up, meeting Leo's gaze for the first time since the conversation began. Her voice was quiet, barely more than a whisper. "What happens now?" Leo's expression softened, though the disappointment remained. "Now you face the consequences. There will be a trial. The department has also initiated new training programs to address racial bias, and we're implementing reforms to ensure this doesn't happen again." Karen nodded, though the weight of those words felt distant, as if they were happening to someone else. She was being held accountable, as she should have been. But what stung the most wasn't the loss of her job or the charges against her. It was the realization that she had become the very thing she had sworn to fight against. Leo stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. "Karen, the system is designed to protect everyone, not just the people we think deserve it. We failed when we let our biases get in the way of justice. And you failed when you stopped seeing people as individuals." Peter opened the door, and 2 officers stepped in to escort Karen out of the room. She stood slowly, her legs feeling weak beneath her, and followed them without resistance. There was nothing left to fight. Her fight was over. As she walked down the hallway, flanked by the officers, the murmur of voices and the hum of the precinct faded into the background. She could feel the eyes of her colleagues on her, some filled with pity, others with quiet disdain. But none of that mattered now. She had to face the consequences of her actions, and nothing could change what had already been done. Part 9. Karen's Path to Redemption. Months later, the world had shifted. Karen, no longer a police officer, sat in a small, dimly lit room. The trial had come and gone, and she had faced her punishment. But the hardest part wasn't the legal consequences. It was the internal reckoning. For the first time in years, Karen had been forced to confront her own reflection, to see herself for who she had truly become. She had been blind to her biases, had allowed them to fester until they guided her every action. But now, sitting in the quiet aftermath of it all, she understood something she hadn't before. Acknowledgement was only the first step. True redemption would come from change. Karen had started attending workshops and therapy sessions, digging deep into the roots of her prejudice, into the systemic biases that had shaped her worldview. It was painful, uncomfortable, and humbling, but it was necessary. As the months passed, she began to feel the slow, steady shift within her. The anger and defensiveness that had once dominated her thoughts were being replaced by understanding, by empathy. She had hurt people, not just through her actions but through her inaction, through her unwillingness to see beyond the surface. And now she was determined to make things right, not just for herself but for the community she had failed. Her story had become a cautionary tale within the precinct, a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked bias. But more than that, it had become a beacon of change. The department had implemented new training programs focused on dismantling the racial prejudices that had been allowed to take root. Officers were being taught to see beyond stereotypes, to approach every case with fairness and humanity. And Karen, she was still on her path of redemption, knowing it was a lifelong journey. She couldn't undo the past, but she could work toward a better future, one where justice was truly blind, and one where people were seen for who they were, not for the color of their skin. The road ahead was long, but for the first time in years, Karen wasn't running from it. She was walking toward it, one step at a time.